It began, as these stories often do, with perfection, or at least the illusion of it. A mansion perched on a hill, the glint of a Mercedes in the driveway, and the soft laughter of dinner parties that went on too late into the night. To neighbors, Evelyn Brandt and her husband Richard were the embodiment of wealth done right. She was elegance personified, always poised, always gracious. He was the successful businessman, a self-made millionaire who built his fortune in construction and real estate. Together, they looked unbreakable. But beneath the polished surface, the cracks had already begun to form. Richard had a reputation, ruthless in business, often dismissive at home. He was known to control everything: finances, friends, even Evelyn's wardrobe. To outsiders, it was discipline. To Evelyn, it was a gilded cage. For years, she played her part, the perfect wife, the loyal hostess, but the resentment festered. Each lavish trip and sparkling diamond became a reminder of the one thing she didn't have: control. Their marriage had turned cold, the intimacy replaced with suspicion. Rumors began to spread quietly among those who dared to look closer. Richard was having an affair, or several. Evelyn knew. She always knew. But leaving wasn't simple. Divorce would mean scandal, financial ruin, and humiliation. For a woman who had built her life around appearances, that was unthinkable. And so, Evelyn began to imagine another solution. It started small. Thoughts whispered in the dark, questions of what would happen if Richard wasn't around. What if the empire he built could be hers instead? She knew his insurance policies, his assets, his holdings. She had heard him boast about being worth more dead than alive. And that thought, quiet, poisonous, began to take root. Friends noticed subtle changes. Evelyn became distant, more calculating. Her smile didn't reach her eyes anymore. She started meeting people, quietly, discreetly. A bartender who knew everyone, a private investigator with a reputation for cutting corners. And then, one night, a man named Caleb entered the picture. Caleb was nothing like Richard. Young, brash, charming in a dangerous way. He worked security for one of Richard's companies, but his loyalty wasn't to his boss. It was to the money he could make. And Evelyn had plenty to offer. What began as flirtation quickly evolved into something darker. Within weeks, they were lovers. Within months, they were conspirators. She spoke of Richard's cruelty, his arrogance, how she deserved better. Caleb listened, and then he offered a solution neither dared say aloud at first. The plan was simple on paper, monstrous in reality. Remove Richard, make it look like a robbery, and split the payout. Evelyn hesitated, at least at first, but temptation has a way of blurring morality when you've spent too long feeling powerless. The plan started to take shape in secret. Evelyn studied Richard's routines, the nights he came home late, the routes he took to his construction sites, the security codes only she knew. Every detail mattered. Every step had to be perfect. In the daylight, she still played her part. She kissed him goodbye, hosted brunches, smiled for photos, but at night, she and Caleb whispered about death, about freedom, about wealth. And as the first pieces of the plan fell into place, Evelyn felt something she hadn't in years: excitement. Not the shallow thrill of a new necklace or vacation, but the intoxicating rush of control. For the first time, she wasn't the one being managed. She was the one pulling the strings. The perfect life she had once flaunted had become her disguise. And behind that mask, the real story was only just beginning.
The morning after the argument, Evelyn sat alone in her white robe, staring into the untouched coffee cup on the marble counter. A decision had already formed in her mind. It wasn't rage anymore, it was calculation. She was tired of waiting for happiness to find her. She was going to take it, by any means necessary. In the weeks that followed, she began reaching out, subtly, discreetly. A friend of a friend, a bartender who knew people. A whisper exchanged in a late-night parking lot. The trail eventually led her to a man named Carlos Vega, a mechanic by trade, but known in the city shadows as a man who could make problems disappear. He wasn't the kind of killer from movies, no fancy suits, no clean escapes. Carlos was blunt, practical, and very real. When Evelyn met him for the first time, it was in the back room of a car repair shop that smelled of oil and cigarettes. The rain outside drummed against the metal roof as she slid a small envelope across the table. Photographs of her husband, his schedule, and a down payment in cash. Her hands shook slightly, but her voice did not, she said. It has to look like a robbery. Clean, fast, no mistakes. Carlos looked at her for a long moment. You sure you want this? Evelyn met his gaze. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. In that moment, the contract was born. A deal struck not on paper, but in silence, sealed by greed, resentment, and desperation. Evelyn left that shop convinced she'd just purchased her freedom. What she didn't realize was that she had also purchased her own undoing. Meanwhile, Martin, oblivious to the plan, continued with his predictable routines. Morning runs, business calls, dinners with clients. The marriage had grown cold, but he never imagined betrayal would come from his own home. He was preparing for a business trip to Chicago, a perfect opportunity, Evelyn thought. She knew the route he'd take, the hotel he'd stay in, and when he'd be alone. Carlos, however, wasn't acting alone. He brought in a young accomplice, Javier, barely 22, reckless and eager to prove himself. Evelyn never met him directly, but her fate would soon intertwine with his. Javier's first words to Carlos were, "Easy money, right?" Carlos only smirked. There's no such thing as easy money. The plan was simple, or so they thought. On the night of Martin's departure, Evelyn kissed him goodbye for the last time. "Drive safe," she whispered, her tone soft, her heart oddly steady. She watched him leave the driveway, headlights cutting through the misty darkness. Then she sat in silence, waiting. Hours passed, every minute stretched into eternity. But something went wrong. The next morning, a call came. Martin's car had been found, the driver's window shattered, his body slumped over the wheel. 2 gunshots to the chest, wallet missing, car door ajar. It looked, at first glance, like a robbery gone wrong. Evelyn's performance was flawless. Tears, shock, the trembling voice when the police arrived. She even fainted once, clutching a framed wedding photo. Neighbors pitied her, detectives offered condolences, and for a moment, just a moment, she believed she'd gotten away with it. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Javier couldn't keep his mouth shut. Within days, he'd spent most of his cut, new shoes, a flashy watch, and a car he couldn't afford. He boasted in bars, bragged about money earned the easy way. And when word reached the wrong ears, whispers started. A mechanic, a widow, a murder that was too clean, too precise. Detective Morales, the lead investigator, wasn't convinced by the robbery angle. Something about Evelyn's grief seemed rehearsed. Her tears came at perfect intervals, her answers were too tidy. He decided to dig deeper, and what he would uncover next would shatter the illusion Evelyn had built so carefully. The web of deceit was beginning to unravel.
Detective Morales had seen enough crime scenes to recognize when something didn't add up. The robbery theory might have satisfied the press, but not him. The car hadn't been ransacked. The wallet was missing, yes, but Martin's watch, worth over $15,000, was still on his wrist. The supposed random attack felt almost rehearsed, too deliberate. He began quietly retracing Martin's final hours. The hotel security cameras showed nothing unusual, and the gas station on the highway captured only the faint reflection of headlights in the rain. But one detail gnawed at Morales' instincts, a car that seemed to follow Martin's for several miles, always 2 lanes behind. It was registered to a man named Carlos Vega. Vega's record was a patchwork of petty crimes, assault, stolen goods, and an unsolved arson case. Morales had seen his name before. When he asked around the precinct, one of the younger officers nodded knowingly. Yeah, Vega's bad news, but he's careful. Careful or not, Morales knew a trail when he saw one. He visited the garage where Vega worked. The man was polite, maybe too polite, grease-stained hands, nervous smile, the kind that tried too hard to look innocent. Morales noted the faint scent of fresh paint in the back room, like someone had recently tried to cover something up. But it was Javier who cracked first. A week after the murder, police arrested Javier on a minor charge, stolen goods. When Morales entered the interrogation room, he didn't mention the murder at all. Instead, he slid a photo across the table,
Martin's body, the bullet wounds, the shattered glass. "You were there, weren't you?" he said quietly. Javier tried to play tough, but the silence broke him. Within 20 minutes, he was crying, trembling, begging for a deal. What spilled from his mouth painted the picture Morales had suspected all along. Evelyn was behind everything. She had offered them money, detailed Martin's route, and even given them a signal, a text that simply read, "He's leaving now." But Morales needed proof. Words weren't enough, and so began the careful unraveling of Evelyn's web. Her bank records showed unusual withdrawals, $10,000 in cash, spaced just days before Martin's death. Cell phone data placed her at locations she claimed she'd never visited, and when forensics examined Martin's phone, they found deleted messages, recently wiped but not beyond recovery. One of them stood out: "It's time." Evelyn's arrest came quietly, no handcuffs in public, no dramatic chase, just a knock at the door on a calm Thursday morning. When Morales told her the charge, she blinked, just once, and said, "You can't prove anything." But her tone betrayed her. It wasn't defiance, it was fear. In the interrogation room, Evelyn was composed, cold. "You think I'd risk everything for money? My husband was murdered, and now you're blaming me?" Morales didn't respond. He simply laid out the evidence: the withdrawals, the phone logs, the testimony. For hours she refused to speak. But silence has a way of turning on itself. Finally, Evelyn whispered, "I didn't mean for it to happen that way." It wasn't a confession, not fully, but it was enough. Morales leaned forward. "Then tell me how it was supposed to happen." Her eyes met his, and in that moment he saw it. Not remorse, but resignation. The mask had cracked. The following morning, the city woke to headlines: "Millionaire's wife arrested in husband's murder plot." Reporters swarmed the courthouse. Neighbors whispered about the woman they'd thought they knew. The story became a sensation: greed, betrayal, and murder in high society. But Morales wasn't celebrating. He'd seen too many tragedies to take pride in catching another one. Behind every headline, he thought, there's a story of choices, each one leading closer to the point of no return. For Evelyn, that point had passed long ago. And yet, even as she sat in her cell that night, staring at the cracked wall, part of her still believed she could talk her way out. After all, money had always saved her before.
The trial of Evelyn Carter became a spectacle, the kind that drew crowds to the courthouse steps and filled every local paper with speculation. Wealth, betrayal, murder. It had all the makings of a modern tragedy. The prosecution painted her as cold, calculating, and dangerously persuasive. The defense, on the other hand, cast her as a grieving widow, framed by low-life criminals trying to save themselves. Inside the courtroom, cameras were banned, but the tension was palpable. Every seat was filled. Martin's family sat in the front row, faces hard as stone. Evelyn's eyes never met theirs. She wore black each day, not as mourning, but as armor. The prosecution began with Detective Morales. Calm and deliberate, he walked the jury through the evidence, the cash withdrawals, the text message, the meeting with Carlos Vega, and then finally Javier's testimony. The young man looked pale as he took the stand, his voice trembling. He said, "She paid us. She told us where he'd be. She said she wanted it to look like a robbery." Evelyn didn't flinch, but her attorney immediately objected. "This boy is trying to save himself. He has every reason to lie." But the jury was watching her. The smallest gestures, the way her jaw tightened, how she looked at the floor instead of her accuser, spoke louder than any statement. Carlos Vega refused to testify, invoking his right to remain silent. He'd already struck a deal, his sentence reduced in exchange for cooperation that never came. Still, his phone records and fingerprints were enough to tie him to the murder weapon. Evelyn's defense tried to argue that Carlos had acted alone, that he'd framed her to cover his own guilt. But Morales' investigation had closed that door long ago. Then came the tapes. Hidden in Javier's phone, the police had found a voice memo, recorded the night of the murder. Evelyn's voice, low and sharp, saying, "Make sure it's done tonight. No mistakes." The courtroom fell silent as the words echoed through the speakers. Evelyn's composure cracked, just slightly, her fingers tightening on the edge of the table. The defense scrambled. They argued the recording was manipulated, that it lacked proper authentication. But the damage was done. The jury had heard her. The words were unmistakable. As the days dragged on, Evelyn began to lose the control she'd once wielded so easily. Her lawyer urged her not to testify, but pride overruled strategy. When she finally took the stand, her voice carried both defiance and desperation. "I loved my husband. Yes, I was angry. We fought, but I didn't kill him. I was manipulated, set up by people who saw an opportunity." The prosecution rose slowly, holding up a photo of Martin, smiling, alive. "You mean manipulated into paying $10,000 in cash? Manipulated into sending a text message that read, 'It's time'? Or manipulated into telling a hired killer, quote, 'Make sure it's done tonight'? Which manipulation was that, Mrs. Carter?" Her silence was answer enough. When closing arguments came, Morales watched from the gallery. The prosecutor's voice rang steady. This was not a crime of passion. It was a crime of greed. A woman who had everything, wealth, status, comfort, wanted more. And she was willing to destroy the one person who trusted her most to get it. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. "Guilty," the foreman said, "on all counts." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Evelyn closed her eyes, her face drained of color. As the judge read the sentence, life without parole, she whispered something under her breath. No one could quite hear what it was, but Detective Morales thought he knew. It wasn't an apology. It was disbelief that for the first time in her life, money couldn't buy her way out. As she was led away, flashbulbs exploded outside. Reporters shouted questions, but Evelyn didn't look back. The woman who once commanded rooms with her beauty and charm now vanished behind cold steel doors. Another name added to the long list of tragedies born from greed.
Prison was nothing like Evelyn Carter's world. Gone were the silk robes, the glittering galas, the wine-stained laughter of high society. Her days were now marked by routines she couldn't control. 5 a.m. wake-up calls, harsh lights, numbered uniforms. The woman who once commanded luxury now stood in line for meals, silent, unseen. At first, she tried to fight it. Lawyers were called, appeals were filed. Statements of innocence were crafted with the same elegance she once used to host charity events. But each attempt failed. Her name, once whispered with admiration at social gatherings, became synonymous with deceit. The tabloids had long since moved on, but the stain on her reputation was permanent. In her cell, Evelyn replayed the moments that led her there. The argument, the plan, the envelope of cash. She told herself she didn't mean for Martin to die, that she only wanted to scare him, force him to see her worth again. But deep down, she knew the truth. Once she'd made that first call to Carlos Vega, there was no turning back. Detective Morales visited her once, months after the sentencing. It wasn't official business. He said he just wanted to hear her side, to understand the why. She smiled faintly through the glass. "You think there's a reason that makes it make sense?" Morales said nothing. "I loved him," she continued. "But love, it doesn't pay for silence. It doesn't make you feel powerful. You think you know what it's like, detective, to live in someone's shadow your entire life?" He studied her carefully. "I think you mistook love for control, and when control slipped away, you tried to buy it back." Her eyes hardened. "You wouldn't understand." Morales left soon after, certain of one thing. Evelyn Carter didn't feel remorse. She felt loss, but not for Martin, for the life she'd once ruled. In time, she faded from the public memory. Her name stopped appearing in headlines, her story replaced by newer scandals. But within the prison walls, whispers of her past still lingered. Some inmates called her the heiress. Others avoided her altogether. She remained composed, always immaculate, as if trying to preserve a final shred of the identity she destroyed. Outside, the world moved on. Martin's family sold the estate, donated most of his wealth to charities he had once supported. His sister, when asked by a journalist if she forgave Evelyn, said simply, "Forgiveness is for the living." Years passed. Evelyn grew older, her beauty replaced by something harder, resignation. Each morning she walked the same yard, counting the same cracks in the concrete. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd traded her freedom for the illusion of control. And in the end, she controlled nothing. On the anniversary of Martin's death, she received a letter. No return address. Inside was a single photograph, Martin at a beach, smiling, before everything fell apart. On the back, in faded ink, were 2 words, "Still waiting." She never found out who sent it. Maybe it was his sister. Maybe someone else who
who believed that justice was more than a verdict. That night, Evelyn sat awake until dawn, staring at the photo. For the first time in years, she cried. Not for Martin, not even for the life she lost, but for the emptiness that had followed every choice. Detective Morales retired the following spring. On his last day, a young officer asked him which case had stayed with him the most. He thought for a moment and then said, "The one that showed me how easy it is for people to mistake desire for love and greed for need." The officer nodded, unsure what he meant, but Morales understood it all too well. In the end, the story of Evelyn Carter wasn't just about murder. It was about a truth as old as time, that no amount of wealth can fill the void left by a heart consumed with envy, and that sometimes the price of having everything is losing yourself completely. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves real-life mysteries. But I want to know what you think. Was Evelyn Carter truly a victim of her own greed, or was there something deeper behind her choices? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because sometimes the truth isn't as clear as it seems.